My name is Ryan Stillwell. I'm the owner here at Stillwell Risk Partners. We are a commercial insurance and risk management firm, and one of the things that we specialize in is cyber liability insurance. Today, I'm going to talk about some basic information about cyber liability insurance. What are some good examples of policies and some bad examples of policies? So if you're new to the world of cyber liability insurance, this is a good place to start. I'm going to go over I'm not going to go in depth about coverage. I'm just going to show what a bad policy looks like and what a good policy looks like, right? So the key here, number one, is do you have a standalone cyber liability policy? There are a few exceptions here, but for the most part, if you have a standalone cyber liability policy, that's a great starting point. The comparison here is if you have a cyber liability insurance coverage that's attached to another policy. Most common example here is on a general liability or business owner's policy, where you've got an endorsement on there that provides some type of cyber liability insurance. Typically, those coverages are low limit. Oftentimes, you can get higher limits on those. However, the coverage is not as comprehensive as what you would get from a standalone policy. One notable exception to that is if you're in the technology industry or you're something integral to your operations revolves around technology. Oftentimes what we see is an E&O policy, like a technology errors and omissions policy, gets combined with the cyber liability. And those policies make sense to put together because the coverages are closely related. But in general, if you don't have a technology E&O policy, you don't need one. A standalone policy is almost always best. So I'm going to bring up some examples here to take a look at. So here what you see is a snapshot of a policy declarations page, right? And you can see here your schedule of coverage, and it lists a whole lot of policy coverage areas. See at the bottom here, cyber liability. If you see if your only cyber liability coverage comes on a package with all these other coverages, you're generally not getting a great policy. Now, I say that I have not seen all the policies in the world. I just know from a best practice standpoint that if this is where your coverage comes from, you're not getting the type of coverage you could get somewhere else. I'll go into something else in just a second. So on that same policy that I'm referencing here, these are the limits of coverage, right? So $100,000. If you're a small business, you might not need more than $100,000 in coverage. However, that's tough limit because it's very easy to exceed that, right? Now let's say, for example, that your main concern is you don't hold personally identifiable information of your clients, or at least enough in mass that you're worried about a liability suit or to have significant costs from a regulatory perspective. But this is your aggregate limit at 100,000, right? Take a look at some of these other things: regulatory defense and penalties, $25,000, right? So if you process payment cards on your platform and there's an issue there, you might have a regulatory issue with payment cards, right? And maybe see it from a regulatory basis. You also see fines. Both of those are $25,000 limits. Pretty easy to surpass those for many small businesses. The other thing I'll note here is cyber extortion aggregate, $20,000. If you're subject to a ransomware attack, average ransomware payouts can be $40,000, $50,000. That's on average. So $20,000 may not be enough coverage to provide you with the right limits of protection. And what type of services is the insurance carrier offering to you with their cyber extortion coverage? Are they negotiating on your behalf? Do they pay for the cost of cyber extortion on your behalf, or do they just reimburse you, right? Are they walking you through the process to make sure that you're taking every step possible to protect your data and to make sure that you're able to gain that access? You know, there's a lot of questions that come from this. So while there are a good amount of different coverages on here, including website media, content liability, that's a good coverage at up to $100,000. Are they enough, right? Now, what you'll see here is an example of a good policy, right? This is a standalone cyber liability policy, and you can see here that already just on part of the coverage, there's a whole other page of this. We're basically looking at twice as many different coverage lines, at least for this policy, as compared to the cyber liability insurance that's attached to another policy. And so you've got much higher limits, $1 million per claim, $1 million aggregate. That PCI and that regulatory defense, $1 million each. Bodily injury liability, if there were to be a result of bodily injury liability or property damage, like physical injury or damage as the result of a cybercrime, you have some coverage for that. Now, granted, these are relatively low limits, and sometimes you can get them increased, but these are more customizable, right? Breach event costs, post-breach remediation cost coverage at $25,000, right? Bringing in somebody that knows what they're doing from a forensic standpoint to identify where things came from, to make sure that there's no lingering malignant code in there, right? Let's highlight a few other things in here. All right, so this is the other half of the coverage, and you can see how much more coverage you have here. Cyber extortion at up to $1 million, dependent system failure coverage up to $1 million. Financial fraud, there's sublimited here, and then the fraud aspect is very often sublimited, but you have options from a customizable standpoint to increase some of these limits as well. Bricking loss coverage is there physical damage to your own property, right? When you talk about bodily injury or property damage, it's always to others, right? Bricking loss is physical damage to your own coverage or to your own equipment. And you can see here, there's just, it goes into a lot more detail. Now, this is an example where additional defense costs are not applicable. So you have defense costs within these limits, but there are also ways to customize these policies to get additional defense costs, have them be outside of the normal limits, or just flat out increase these coverage limits, which with carriers that are offering this as an endorsement to a business owner's policy, a lot of times you can't get coverage limits beyond $250,000 in aggregate. So, like I said, this is just an example of when you're looking at your cyber liability coverage, if you have it, some ways to determine whether or not you have appropriate coverage for your business. If you have these limits versus these limits, you'll get a really good idea. If you have a policy, if you have a package policy that includes general liability and property and auto and umbrella, and your cyber liability is only attached to that package, you probably know that you don't have enough coverage or the more comprehensive type of policy that you can get elsewhere. So I hope this was helpful to you. I'm going to be providing some more information about going into a little bit more in depth in terms of the types of coverage that are available, so you have some knowledge going into when you're looking at cyber liability for the first time, or maybe you have a renewal coming up. And if you have questions, we are here to help. Reach out to us. We're happy to consult and see if it makes sense to take a deeper look. My name is Ryan Stillwell. I'm the owner here at Stillwell Risk Partners. We help our clients take control of their risk.